UFC fighters that have recently fell off. That's what I want to discuss in this video today. You know, the UFC has guys that have, along their careers, gone on massive losing streaks. And that's not what I'm really here to talk about today. More so want to talk about fighters that were on and like really good and maybe a top 5 fighter or a championship challenger at one point. And now they're in a part of their career where it's like, man, this guy's kind of fell off a cliff and he's either at the end of his career or he might get a win soon. I don't know. But yeah, I have 10 fighters on this list that have recently fell off, and it sucks to see, man. It just goes to show how brutal this sport can truly be. So if you guys enjoy these kind of videos, do me a favor and drop a like on it. Starting off with the first guy, Steve Ersg. Now, if you guys don't know, Steve Ersg started out the gate hot in the UFC, 3-0 in the UFC. And he got a title shot off of being 3-0 in the UFC. And in some people's eyes, Steve Ersg actually defeated Pantoja, which in hindsight is insane. He went to an absolute war with Pantoja, some of the greatest flyweight striking exchanges you will ever see. And in a lot of people's eyes, as I say, he should have wrested the belt away from Alessandro Pantoja. I believe at UFC 301, that was the main event. And yeah, man, everybody was like, man, how good is Steve Ersg? He was right there neck and neck with Pantoja. This guy's a future champion. And boy, could people have not been more wrong, because currently Steve Ersg is now on a 3-fight losing streak, and with another loss he might be cut because he just got scheduled to fight Alex Perez. And Alex Perez is obviously a perennial contender in that flyweight division who's not doing so great in his own career, but it's just crazy, man. Steve Ersg from 3-0, extremely promising, one of the best strikers at flyweight, to getting knocked out by Kattar France, dominated by Brandon Moreno after having that razor close fight with Pantoja. And yeah, 3-fight losing streak. He's now 3-3 in the UFC. Started off 3-0. That's actually crazy if you think about it. And if he loses to Alex Perez, which I don't think he will, but if he does, that will be a 4-fight losing streak. Granted, he has really strong competition, but you know the UFC, once you start hitting that 3- and 4-fight win streak, you might be cut on another loss if you're Steve Ersg. But, you know, he is a fan favorite. He's Australian. The UFC seems to love the market in Australia, so they might keep him around even with another loss. But yeah, Steve Ersg has definitely fallen off in recent times. Moving on to the next guy that's fallen off, Israel Adesanya. Now, Adesanya started off his UFC career, obviously hot out the gate, 12-0 in the UFC, undefeated in his entire career. At one point, Israel Adesanya was 20-0, 12-0 in the UFC, and he ultimately wrested the belt away from Robert Whittaker back in 2019, went on to defend that belt 5 times. And he was deemed as one of the greatest strikers, which I never really believed in, but that narrative has kind of been put to rest. I still think he's a great striker, but I don't think he's one of the greatest strikers. And I'll explain why in a second. But yeah, just to see the heights that Izzy reached in his career, to see where he's at now, because currently he's 1-4 in his last 5. So, and he's on a 3-fight losing streak, and he hasn't won a fight since 2022. And he's been knocked down by Sean Strickland, which is questionable chin. He's been knocked down by Dricus. He's been knocked out by Nasruddin Imavov. He's been knocked out by Alex Pereira. So, man, Izzy's chin seems to be deteriorating, and going from 12-0 in the UFC to 13-5 is actually insane. Before he fought Jan Blachowicz, as I said, he was 12-0, 5-time defending UFC champion at one point. And yeah, man, now he's 1-4 in his last 5 on a 3-fight losing streak and hasn't won a fight going on 3 years. July of 2022 was the last time Israel Adesanya got his hand raised in the octagon. And you really got to question, is this the end of Israel Adesanya, you know? Because Adesanya, he's been around in the UFC since 2018. So what, that's 7 years. He came in at the age of like 28 years old. He's 35, nearly 36 years old now, and his chin seems to be getting worse and worse. And I just don't know if Israel Adesanya has what it takes to beat the absolute sharks that are at the top of middleweight at this point. Dricus, Hamzat, Cal Baraujo, Nasruddin Imavov, who just recently defeated him. Even Anthony Hernandez, Roman Dolidze, a lot of these guys would give Israel Adesanya a very tough fit, especially in his current state. I think Prime Izzy could beat some of those guys, but he's just not in his prime anymore. So yeah, I'd say Israel Adesanya has fallen off in recent times. Getting on to the next fighter, Jamal Hill. Now, Jamal Hill's fall off doesn't need to be studied quite yet, but it might need to be studied in the future if he goes on to get finished by Khalil Rountree. But Jamal Hill started off his UFC career 5-1, right? His only loss coming to kind of a loss to Paul Craig, as the high-level guys at light heavyweight seem to do. Magomed Ankalaev also has a loss to Paul Craig, but started off his UFC career 5-1. Dominated Glover for the belt in 2023. It was a vacant title, and people were favoring Glover to win that belt. And he was deemed the hardest hitter in the light heavyweight division, which I always thought was kind of overrated. Jamal Hill being one of the hardest hitters, because think about it. He fought Glover Teixeira for 5 rounds at 43 years old, who was coming off a war with Yuri, and couldn't even drop him. I don't believe he even dropped him. He battered him, of course, but people base Jamal Hill's so-called power off of when he fought Johnny Walker and knocked out Johnny Walker, but that's not really indicative of having a lot of power. So I always thought the hardest hitter thing was kind of a false narrative, but nonetheless, the fans deemed him as being one of the hardest hitters at light heavyweight, dominated Glover for the belt. At one point, 5-1 in the UFC champion, but he got injured, and then whenever he came back from his injury, now we're looking at Jamal Hill, who's on a 2-fight losing streak. Both times he was finished by strikes. Granted, it's Pereira and Yuri who finished him, 2 amazing fighters, but I think it really showed. Those 2 fights, to me, kind of exposed how bad Jamal Hill really is in the striking. Go watch Jamal Hill in the striking. He has some of the worst footwork at light heavyweight I've ever seen. He looks like Jimmy Crute in there sometimes. Go watch that Yuri fight back. The dude's so flat-footed. He doesn't move around well. It's not good for Jamal Hill. And I'm worried for him in this Khalil fight because he just got finished by Yuri. He seems to always want to rush in after being KO'd. So, yeah, man, I'd say Jamal Hill is falling off in recent times. He hasn't had a win since January of 2023, so 2.5 years. I know he was out with injury for a while, and then he comes back to get finished 2 more times. Jamal Hill, Mr. Sweet Dreams, if he loses to Khalil Roundtree, it might be sweet dreams to his UFC career, but maybe not. He's stepped up on events to save like UFC 300, so maybe he has a soft spot in the UFC's heart. But yeah, I think Jamal Hill has fallen off in recent times. Getting on to the next guy, Sergey Palic. This one hurts me because you know what? Whenever he fought Tom Aspinall, I actually thought he was going to beat Tom Aspinall because whenever Sergey Palic came into the UFC, if you guys don't know, he lost his UFC debut to Alistair Overeem by finish, right? But after losing that debut to Alistair Overeem by finish, he went on an absolute vengeance, 6 first-round finishes in a row, and deemed to have the most power in the heavyweight division. This guy was knocking out everybody. Knocked out Derek Lewis. Knocked out Tai Tuivasa. Who else did he knock out? Knocked out Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Some other guys, too. I'm just drawing blank in my head. But yeah, man, Sergey Palic was known as the Russian Hands of Stone. This guy was going around knocking out everybody. And in the first round, 6 first-round finishes in a row, which is unheard of in the UFC. Typically, guys are able to get a bunch of finishes in a row, but 6 in a row in the first round is crazy. And yeah, he was deemed as having the most power in the division. But then the fall off for Palic started. Now 1-2 in his last 3. Yes, he won his last fight against Jairzinho Rozenstruik. But the thing about Palic, man, is he lost all his aura, right? He got knocked out by Tom Aspinall in trying to go for the interim belt back in 2023. And then he got pieced up and destroyed on the feet of Alexander Volkov. And then, to make matters worse, in the Jairzinho Rozenstruik, this guy is a dangerous striker turned smudge grappler. Go back and watch his fight against Jairzinho Rozenstruik. He genuinely looked terrified to engage on the feet and just took down Rozenstruik over and over. And I think that really showed that Tom Aspinall really took Sergey Palic's soul, and he's just not that same guy, man. He seems tentative on the feet. He seems like he's scared to engage, like he's afraid that his chin's going to fail him. And just in his last 2 fights before the win against Rozenstruik, he took a ton of damage. He got KO'd out cold by Tom Aspinall, and then he took a lot of damage against Volkov. So I don't know if we're ever going to see Sergey Palic as a top contender at heavyweight again. I know he's still highly ranked, but man, what does Gelton Almeida do to him if he gets him down, you know? Tom Aspinall smokes him again. I think Volkov in a rematch would smoke him. I'd even favor Cyril Gane to piece him up at this point because I think we all overrated his knockout power and overrated his striking ability. He's kind of just a brute force that kind of just swings big, meaty hooks in the pocket. And a lot of times whenever you're facing guys like Tuivasa and Derek Lewis, you're able to get away with that. But when you run into the Tom Aspinalls and the Volkovs, you get pieced up. And that's exactly what happened with Sergey. So yeah, I think Sergey Palic has fallen off in recent times. Getting on to the next guy, Leon Rocky Edwards, at one point in his UFC career was on an absolute tear. If you guys don't know, Leon actually lost his UFC debut against Kamaru Usman, but after that, he went on a 12-1-1. Or he started off in the UFC 12-1-1 on a 12-fight unbeaten streak. Only thing that stopped the unbeaten streak was whenever he got that eye poke no contest against Bilal, but a 12-fight unbeaten streak. And then he captured the welterweight title, KOing Kamaru Usman and defending the title against him in the trilogy. So he started off 0-1 to Kamaru Usman, ended up going 2-1 over him. 2-time defending champ, defending the belt against Usman and then against Colby. And Leon Edwards seemed to be on top of the world. I never thought he was going to be a dominant champion, but to see how bad his fall off has been in recent times, just through 2 fights, really speaks volumes at how much Leon Edwards just what do I want to say? Kind of drinking his own Kool-Aid in a way, because Leon Edwards is now on a 2-fight losing streak, got absolutely dominated in his last 2 fights. And some people are arguing, is he even top 5 worthy anymore, man? Because Leon Edwards, how do you go from 12-1-1 in the UFC, man? How did this guy ever go on a 12-fight win streak, first of all? Was the welterweight division really that bad? Because listen, dude, no disrespect to Leon, but man, just seeing how bad Sean Brady manhandled him and how Bilal just beat him up on the ground, it's just not a good look for Leon Edwards, man. Where does Leon Edwards go after that Sean Brady loss? I've never seen a fighter get dominated, a former champion that just coming off of one loss, get dominated as bad as Leon Edwards did against Sean Brady. Like, that was an embarrassment. Now he's on a 2-fight losing streak. Sean Brady actually broke a record against Leon Edwards for the most control time in a round. 4 minutes and 57 seconds in the second round, I believe. He destroyed Leon Edwards in that fight. And yeah, man, it's like, with all these new killers coming up in the welterweight division, who does he beat? I think he loses to Ian Gary. I think he loses to Michael Morales. I think he loses to Shavkat. I think he loses to Bilal in a rematch. So it's like, at this point, if you're Leon Edwards, man, you're in a tough spot. He's almost 34 years old. I don't think he has that same hunger to become a champion anymore. So, yeah, man, we might see Leon Edwards go on a generational downfall or retire on another loss if he goes on a 3-fight losing streak. So, yes, I do believe that Leon Edwards has fallen off in recent times. Getting on to the next fighter that has fallen off, Deiveson Figueiredo. Now, this one I contemplated not putting on the list, but seeing how he kind of got beat up and injured against Corey Sandhagen, it wasn't a good look, and then he got destroyed before that. But let's talk about how he started off. Deiveson Figueiredo started off in the UFC 8-1. His only loss coming to Jussier Formiga back in the day, but 8-1 in the UFC, deemed as the hardest hitter in flyweight history. This guy was knocking out everybody. He literally 10-7 Joseph Benavidez in the first round in their second fight, and ended up becoming a 2-time defending champ. He defended his belt against Alex Perez by submission in the first round, and then he defended again against Brandon Moreno in a draw. Yes, if you get a draw, it is a defense of your title because the other guy didn't wrest the belt away from you. So 2 title defenses, and he ended up going on to fight in a quadrilogy with Brandon Moreno, which is one of the greatest 4 fights in the UFC we'll ever see. If you guys want to see some instant classics, go watch Figueiredo versus Moreno, all 4 of their fights. Absolutely nuts. But obviously in recent times, he moved up to the bantamweight division, right? And you know what? Deiveson Figueiredo started off in the bantamweight division actually doing very well. He was 3-0. The levels of competition weren't the best, but nonetheless, he was 3-0 in the bantamweight division. People were like, okay, can Figueiredo go on a championship run? Well, now he's on a 2-fight losing streak, and he's looking slower and older, man. People don't realize that Deiveson Figueiredo is actually 37 years old at bantamweight, which we know in the lower weight classes, being that old, it's rough, man, because you have to depend on your skill and your speed more than your power, like the upper weight classes. So at 37, on a 2-fight losing streak, he kind of just got pieced up and finished by Corey Sandhagen, and he kind of just got outworked and out-hustled by Petr Yan in the fight before that last year. So it's like, at this point in his career, coming off a leg tear, I believe, against Sandhagen. So that means he's probably going to be out for 9 months to a year now, rehabbing that injury. When he comes back, he'll probably be 38 years old. It's like, Deiveson Figueiredo, I think, he's on a slight downward spiral right now, but I think if he continues to fight in his older age, I think we're going to see this guy go on a 3, 4, maybe even 5-fight losing streak. So honestly, you had a good career, dude. You're a 2-time flyweight champion. It might be time for Deiveson Figueiredo to hang it up. I know a lot of people will disagree, but I like I said, Father Time's undefeated for a reason. And yeah, I think he's on a slight downwards fall right now. Let's get on to the next one. Calvin Kattar. Now, this one is also interesting because you can argue that Calvin Kattar fell off a while back as he hasn't had a win in years. But nonetheless, this guy he started off in the UFC, right? 6-2 in the UFC. A long-time top 5 contender. This guy was in the top 5 for, I think, at least 3 or 4 years, just fighting the Josh Emmons, fighting the Max Holloways, fighting even the Zabit Magomed-Sharipovs back in the day, fighting the Jeremy Stevens of the division. He was a solid top 5 perennial contender, kind of like a Jorge Masvidal of featherweight, He was a solid guy. But now, Calvin Kattar, he ain't looking so good, man, because Calvin Kattar's now on a 4-fight losing streak. He's 1-5 in his last 6 fights, and he's barely ranked. This guy was top 5 forever, and now he's ranked number 15 in the UFC featherweight division, and he arguably shouldn't even be ranked, but nonetheless, he's ranked number 15, right? 1-5 in his last 6 fights. That's actually crazy. when he started off in his UFC career, 6-2. I don't think Calvin Kattar has had a win since 2022. So it's been over 3 years since we've seen him win in the octagon. Granted, he had an injury in between, but a 4-fight losing streak. And he didn't look horrible in his last fight, but he is aging, man. He's 37 years old, you know. He just dropped a decision to unranked Yusuf Zalal. And 4-fight losing streak, it's like, what is his motivation at this point to train? What is his motivation to keep going if you're losing this many fights in a row? So Calvin Kattar should arguably hang it up. I think he just got booked against Steve Garcia. And I think Steve Garcia is going to finish this guy. We're going to see Calvin Kattar get finished for the first time in a long time. Has he ever been finished in the UFC? Let me know in the comments. But yeah, man, Calvin Kattar's fall off needs to be studied from top 5 perennial contender to 4-fight losing streak and 1-5 in his last 6 fights. Another thing that frustrates me about Calvin Kattar is he just never seemed to evolve in his career. If you've seen one Calvin Kattar fight, you've seen them all. He fights the same every single time. Elbows and boxing, no ground game, no kicks, no new wrinkles to his game. So yeah, I think Calvin Kattar should hang it up at 37 years old. I don't see him evolving anymore. And I think he's going to go on a 5-fight losing streak and arguably get cut from the UFC after his next fight. But no disrespect to Calvin Kattar. He had a solid career. Getting on to the next guy, Brian Ortega. One of my least favorite fighters in the UFC simply because he's a rank squatter, and I can't stand rank squatters. But let's talk about how he started. Brian Ortega started off undefeated in the UFC, right? 14-0 in the UFC. 14-0 in his career, 6-0 in the UFC. Actually, Brian Ortega was the first guy to finish Frankie Edgar by strikes. If you know, you know. Brian Ortega looked to be a promising contender at featherweight. He also bagged one of the most promising and pretty young women in Tracy Cortez in the UFC. All the simps love Tracy Cortez. Brian Ortega had her at one point, but you know, according to him, he hit it and quit it and moved on with his life. All jokes aside, Brian Ortega recently, I know he's only coming off of 1 loss, but let's be real, man. This guy's 2-4 in his last 6. And he's coming off a beatdown. Diego Lopez beat the brakes off of Brian Ortega. He hasn't fought since September. He honestly fights like once a year. It's kind of crazy this guy was ever like, what was he? He was 14-0 in his career, and now he's 16-4. So it's tough for Brian Ortega. I understand why he takes off so much time in between his fights. It's because he gets his ass beat every single time he fights. He got his ass beat against Max. He got his ass beat against Volkanovski. He got his ass beat against Diego Lopez recently. Brian Ortega just loves to get the hell beat out of him. So every time he fights, he needs to take off like a year. I know he had that submission win against Yair, but he also was low-key submitted by Yair because Yair popped his arm out of socket with an awkward position. But nonetheless, coming off a beatdown loss, 2-4 in his last 6, now 34 years old. Brian Ortega, you know, he was reborn with the Eagle process or whatever you want to call it, but it might be time for Unk himself, Brian Ortega, to hang it up because this guy is just ranked squad, and I think he's ranked like number 6 or 7 in featherweight. He arguably shouldn't even be in the top 10 anymore. 2-4 in your last 6. I know he has a recent win over Yair Rodriguez, and that's kind of holding him up in the rankings, but man, outside of that, who's he beat? He beat Yair Rodriguez, and who else did he beat? Korean Zombie? Back in 2021, maybe? Man, Brian Ortega's fall off needs to be studied. But nonetheless, hopefully we see him back in the octagon soon so he can actually defend his ranking and stop squatting on it. Let's get on to the last guy on this list, or as the second to last guy, Chito Vera. Chito Vera, I debated on putting him in this video or not, but he is on a bit of a downward spiral in his career, I think. I think we've seen the best of Marlon Chito Vera whenever he went on like a 5-fight win streak, lost to Sandhagen, and then got a title shot against O'Malley after beating Rob Font. I think that was kind of the best of Chito Vera, but now he's kind of on a downward spiral. Chito Vera is just a guy that's never been able to pull the trigger, you know? He fights tentative, and the only time he ever beats guys that are, quote-unquote, he's better than is whenever he gets a finish in the 3rd round. But Marlon Chito Vera started off, you know? He started off KOing guys, you know? He started off KOing guys. He started off actually able to pull the trigger, at least in the 3rd round. He's been top 5 for years. I think this guy was top 5 back in like 2022 and all the way through 2024. So 3 years, top 5. But it's like currently, man, this guy, it's rough for Marlon Chito Vera recently. 2-fight losing streak, and he's 1-3 in his last 4. He got absolutely destroyed by Corey Sandhagen. He got dominated by Davison Figueiredo, and I forgot who he lost to in his last fight. But nonetheless, Marlon Chito Vera is one of the most frustrating fighters to watch because he has one of the greatest chins in UFC history, yet he fights like he's been KO'd in sparring like 6 times in a row. If you know, you know. Like, why does this guy fight so scared? He has a great chin. He has great technique. He has good power, but yet he fights like he's terrified to fight. I don't understand it. Go back and watch his last fight. Leading up to that fight, he claimed that he was going to pull the trigger faster. He wasn't going to be gun shy, but he was still gun shy, and he'd drop another decision. So it's like for Marlon Vera, I don't know, man. He's been in the UFC since 2014. That's 11 years. 32 years old. He's taken a lot of damage. I know he doesn't wear damage, but he's taken a lot of CTE in his career. And yeah, man, I don't know. After this guy got destroyed by Sean O'Malley, and then he got destroyed by Davis and Figero, it's like, and he just pulled out of his recent fight with the injury. He's getting older. He's 1-3 in his last 4. Yeah, I'd say Marlon Vera has fallen off in recent times. And even in the fights where he beat Dominic Cruz and he beat Frankie Edgar, he was getting his ass kicked, man. The only reason he beat those guys is because he landed Hail Mary finishes against Dominic Cruz in the 4th round and against Frankie Edgar in the 3rd round. This guy gets his ass beat every fight, but he was a top guy for a long time. He's just fallen off recently, and I think we've seen the best of Marlon Vera, and yeah, I think his career is coming to a downward spiral. I don't think he can beat any of the top guys at bantamweight anymore. I just don't think he's good enough. Getting on to the last guy, Benoit Saint-Balsac. Benoit Saint-Denis, at one point, seemed to be a promising guy in the lightweight division. Lucas Tracy will tell you this guy was going to be a champion. And you know what? He had me fooled for a bit. He was on a 5-fight win streak at one point. All finishes, 6-1 in the UFC. He lost his UFC debut. Then he went on an absolute tear, going on a 5-fight finish streak. People were like, hold up. This guy, Benoit Saint-Denis, he has amazing grappling. He has dangerous striking. He KO'd Matt Frevola. He was submitting guys, knocking out guys. But man, after he got booked against Dustin Poirier and got brutally finished, he has just not been the same guy, man. Let's be real. Benoit Saint-Denis was booked against Dustin Poirier, right? I think at UFC 299, which was in 2023, right? Or was it 2024? It was 2024. He was booked against Dustin Poirier, right? Dustin Poirier knocked him out brutally in the 2nd round. Granted, he was doing well in the fight. He got brutally knocked out by Dustin Poirier in the 2nd round. People chalked it up to, Benoit Saint-Denis had staph in that fight. Maybe he wasn't feeling too well. Maybe he couldn't train properly, whatever. So he gets the KO loss. He comes back in September against Moicano. And let me just say, guys, if you want to see an absolute beatdown like no other, go watch Benoit Saint-Denis versus Renato Moicano. That was some of the most damage I've ever seen done on the ground in one round in anybody's UFC career. This guy literally looked like his face got sliced through a meat grinder after the round 1 with Renato Moicano. He got the brakes beaten off of him. He was bleeding. Both eyes were nearly shut. And obviously the doctor had to step in. His face was a bloody mess. And yeah, man, he just looks so slow. And I think Renato Moicano really kind of exposed the grappling of BSD because he was chalked up to be like this decent grappler, but I think he kind of got exposed in the grappling, and Dustin Poirier was able to expose his striking too, because Benoit Saint-Denis, even on his win streak, if you go back and watch it, he's always been kind of a guy that has like no defense on the feet, and he's extremely slow. Not to mention, this guy's only been training MMA for like 6 years, since like 2018. 6-7 years. So it was always going to be hard for this guy to be a top guy. And now he's struggling against B-level guys. Go back and watch that fight against Kyle Prepolek, who took the fight on days' notice. Listen, I know he finished Kyle Prepolek in the 1st round, but man, he looked bad in that fight. And he looked like he was struggling to get a finish over a guy who took the fight on 10-second notice. It's not a good look. I don't think Benoit Saint-Denis beats a single fighter in the top 15 of lightweight. And I'm not trying to be hating. I'm not trying to hate on this guy. I'm just keeping it real. Like, he's just not as skilled as we all thought he was. And I think his last 2 fights, or even 3 fights, exposed that. He still has no defense on the feet. He called out Justin Gaethje, I believe, after his win. Justin Gaethje, as much as I can't stand him, would beat the brakes off of Benoit Saint-Denis and maybe even finish him in the 1st round. But yeah, guys, ultimately, these are 10 UFC fighters I felt like have fallen off in recent times and are going to continue to fall off. I honestly, out of this entire list, I don't think any of these guys are going to make a comeback. I'm going to be honest. Maybe they get a win or 2, but I don't think they're ever going to make like this like resurgence like a Dominic Reyes. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed these kinds of video or enjoyed this video specifically, do me a favor, drop a like, drop me a comment. Also, let me know which other fighters you think have fallen off in recent times and if they're going to come back and make a career resurgence. I appreciate you guys watching the video. I'm out, guys, and peace.